In an age where the internet and social media have such a profound influence over our lives, one could think that loneliness is a sentiment of the past. After all, we can communicate with anyone instantaneously through phone calls, text messages, and if hearing their voice isn't enough, we can see their facial expressions in real time with a video call. This technology has only arisen in the last few decades, and our distant ancestors could only dream of these communication methods. With all of the technology that enables such social connectivity, an individual couldn't be faulted for initially believing that loneliness would be minimized, if not eliminated entirely. However, despite how interconnected our lives can be due to these methods, feelings of loneliness across varying age groups haven't disappeared. In fact, some people assert that they've been exacerbated in recent years, even before the pandemic. While the internet and social media are valuable tools in facilitating instantaneous connections over vast distances, they also present a paradoxical conundrum. The irony of having this advanced technology is that it doesn't eliminate loneliness, as one would believe, but it actually enhances loneliness in particular cases. We're the most connected generation, but it also appears that we've become the loneliest generation. We may be able to efficiently connect with anyone at any time, but does this instant speed dial form of communication actually degrade our relationships? Is it possible that we've forgotten how to form suitable, meaningful relationships instead of amassing the greatest number of friends and contacts online? Perhaps, and that's likely the reason why numerous people are suffering from a palpable sense of loneliness in this interconnected age. Today's discussion will investigate what is being called a loneliness crisis by some observers. I will primarily examine the relationship between loneliness and modern technology, with particular emphasis on how the internet and social media use exacerbates loneliness, and vice versa. Another subsidiary element, but no less important, will be the brief exploration of how modern society's expectations outside of social media further elevates loneliness. This task will be performed through some illustration of findings from background literature. Afterwards, I will provide some commentary and further elaboration on the findings. To begin, how should we define loneliness? Is it a state, a feeling, or a mix of both? In the introduction for her book on the subject, A Biography of Loneliness, The History of an Emotion, Alberti remarks that, quote, "Loneliness is not the state of being alone, then, though it is often mistaken as such. It is a conscious, cognitive feeling of estrangement or social separation from meaningful others, an emotional lack that concerns a person's place in the world." End quote. Indeed, as demonstrated by her definition, loneliness and solitude often get conflated with one another. Although some individuals may feel lonely when they're alone, others tend to feel lonely if they're surrounded by strangers or the wrong people who don't truly value them. This idea is crucial and will be rehashed on multiple occasions. Anyhow, although Alberti agrees that loneliness as a modern affliction has reached epidemic proportions, she cautions against utilizing that terminology so readily. In her mind, this is due to the knee-jerk reaction that it tends to elicit, socially, economically, and politically. We must understand what constitutes loneliness, she asserts, so that we can envision its implications, and therefore provide suitable remedies. Concerning social media in particular, Eric Miller, in his paper, Cyber Loneliness, The Curse of the Cursor, poses an interesting question. Does internet usage promote loneliness, or do lonely people seek out the internet? This question couldn't be more apt for our objectives, and his exploration of other literature provides noteworthy insights. Like Alberti, Miller contends that loneliness isn't the same as being alone. He remarks that, quote, "When we feel that we do not have the number or types of relationships we would like to have, then we are particularly apt to be lonely." End quote. Lacking meaningful relationships and being surrounded by people who don't truly care about us is far more likely to encourage loneliness than simply being isolated. While Miller cites findings where the internet can alleviate feelings of loneliness in elderly people, he also notes that individuals who utilize the internet as a form of escapism tend to feel lonelier, and that those who spend more time on social media tend to experience negative feelings about themselves at a greater rate, compared to those who use it far less often. On this finding specifically, he remarks that, quote, "While additional research is needed to further substantiate this point, if one feels lonely in their everyday offline life, it would seem unlikely that one's virtual presence would necessarily erase such feelings. In sum, there is clear evidence that the internet can create conditions that produce feelings of loneliness and social alienation, and that lonely people may show unique proclivities in terms of how they utilize the internet." End quote. Phrased differently, what you do online and how often you use it can influence the degree of loneliness. Like any tool, the internet can be used improperly and lead to destructive outcomes if you aren't careful. One final study that I'll explicitly reference is by Sarah McComb et al. In their work, the authors wish to examine the relationship between loneliness and feelings of mattering to close friends, as well as if one feels like they matter in general. Regarding their findings, the authors remark that, quote, "As predicted, lower levels of both general mattering and mattering to peers were associated with higher state loneliness. Higher feelings of anti-mattering, feelings of being invisible and insignificant to others, and fears of not mattering were associated with greater trait loneliness, as well as a reduced sense of mattering to friends. The findings illustrate that feeling as though one does not matter to others, i.e., feeling insignificant and unimportant, is associated with increased state and trait loneliness among young women." End quote. While their primary focus was on college-age women, 18 to 25 years of age, the noteworthy idea of wanting to matter and belong can be extrapolated to other demographics. Unsurprisingly, everyone desires to matter to their friends and loved ones. Furthermore, we evidently feel profoundly tangible effects on our person when we believe that we're invisible, or that we aren't valued. Hence, why it's no secret that the internet and social media offer a perceived means to effectively escape those states. Now that significant insights from some of the background literature have been outlined, what should we make of it? Does it seem plausible that we're lonelier than previous generations, and that in spite of this digitally interconnected age, loneliness sentiments have paradoxically been aggravated? Comparable to Alberti's remarks, I'm uncertain if the contemporary widespread perceptions among people, particularly in the Western world, should be classified as an epidemic. In our modern world, we possess technology where we can theoretically reach anyone at any time, no matter where they are in the world, and communicate in real time. So, it shouldn't be difficult to connect with another person if you really want to. 40 years ago, 100 years ago, and so on, people weren't able to communicate as instantaneously as we can. Furthermore, we're not the first generation to experience loneliness and isolation, which likely would have been far more profound in past centuries due to less people existing and how remote, rural living was more common. For those isolated in the past, the loneliness they felt would have been immensely palpable because in some cases they were truly isolated, with other people nowhere in sight. Even if they wished to contact someone, it could take weeks, if not months, to hear back, and that's presuming their communication method succeeds. If someone has a comparable situation today, it wouldn't be as dire because there are means to stay in near constant communication with others, even if they're far away. Of course, this fact is contingent on if you possess the means to do so. My point is that for a significant number of people today, the loneliness they may experience pales in comparison to what their ancestors had to contend with. Being truly isolated with very few people around in the past is vastly different to feeling lonely because certain people don't follow you back on social media. Digressing from this point, while I'm uncertain as to whether the loneliness experienced by a notable number of people has reached epidemic proportions, I'm inclined to agree that the internet and social media has exacerbated loneliness sentiments. When people use these mediums, there's an ostensible proclivity to amass a significant following, to possess a large number of followers, or friends. Furthermore, especially among young people, there's almost an expectation that you should have and use social media. These expectations inevitably invite comparisons between users, comparing how well their lives are going, how many friends they have, etc. It's easy to realize how loneliness becomes worse due to these tools. If you spend a great deal of time looking at posts by others who apparently have something you lack, then of course you're going to feel negative emotions about yourself and your situation. When I was younger, I remember growing up in a time where Facebook and Instagram were beginning to skyrocket in popularity, the next big thing. During those years in middle and high school, it was pretty much expected that you have some form of social media, which I have no doubt continues to a more significant extent these days. I didn't acquire any social media up until grade 12, and before then, I was adamant about staying off it for as long as possible. My rationale for this action was because I had no particular interest in utilizing those mediums. Anyhow, I remember when others would ask me for my Instagram or Facebook, and when I said that I didn't have any social media, they often gave me a strange or questioning look. I wasn't bothered by it too much, but these incidents frequently made me question why it became so imperative to utilize social media. Where did this strong desire originate? Because one wishes to fit in? The fear of missing out? Or perhaps it's more symptomatic of the keeping up with the Joneses lifestyle that has only become more prominent in recent decades. Irrespective of the reason, it wasn't difficult for me to comprehend the allure of social media and how it entranced my generation so strongly. Nowadays, I retain some forms of social media, but I make a point to limit their use because, as the studies have revealed, it's valid that spending more time on these sites is linked with stronger feelings of depression, self-esteem issues, and loneliness. Indeed, when we're bombarded with images of others whose lives are ostensibly going so well, we're automatically going to compare our lives to theirs, at least at a subconscious level if we don't consciously acknowledge it. This is especially valid for relationships, when we witness others who appear to have healthy friendships and romantic relationships, and we don't, then we'll likely experience loneliness because our own relationships are lacking, which fits right into the definition of loneliness as outlined by the literature. You might object and remark that if someone is lonely, irrespective of whether it's due to social media or not, they should reach out to others on those channels and attempt to establish social contacts. Indeed, and this seems legitimate at first glance, but what we've also witnessed is that the quality of relationships has diminished because of social media. Quality over quantity, it's the quality of relationships that fundamentally matter. I recall that I once had over 500 followers, or friends, on Instagram, but how many of them did I interact with on a regular basis? Probably 20 at best. Another 20 or so I would talk with less frequently, but the rest were just friends in name only. So, while I could connect with a significant number of people, I chose not to, and that was because my relationship with them wasn't meaningful. My close circle of family, friends, and a few acquaintances were more important. Losing the ability to form meaningful relationships is perhaps the most detrimental symptom in this age of increased digital connectedness. It further proves the irony of how connected we are, but still so lonely, despite the technology at our fingertips. I'll conclude with some final remarks on the contemporary loneliness situation and possible remedies for it. What has already been asserted is that loneliness and solitude aren't necessarily equivalent. An individual can be alone, but this doesn't automatically imply that they're lonely. It's more probable that the people we surround ourselves with will make us lonely, especially if we believe that we don't matter to them. Additionally, if there's a mismatch between the relationships we desire and how they manifest themselves in reality, then that will make us lonely. Even so, it must be acknowledged that isolation from others for extended periods, much longer than we desire, would also probably cause loneliness. As the recent pandemic has demonstrated, extended social isolation due to lockdowns and quarantines devastated the mental health of numerous people. Tragically, some people weren't able to recover from that, whereas others are attempting to find their way back from the brink. For those who tend to feel lonely when they're alone, a solution could be to spend less time on social media. Attending a face-to-face community, like a church group for example, is immensely helpful if one desires to experience a robust sense of belonging where you can truly matter and attempt to develop meaningful relationships. Seeking to formulate robust in-person relationships is a constructive first step, yet in the same vein, you cannot truly depend on others to mitigate those sentiments, just like happiness. Your happiness cannot solely depend on another person. There has to be contentment with yourself and where you are. If changes are required, then perform some introspection to uncover where alterations can be undertaken. Prayer can also serve to illuminate the path, as God can see what we initially cannot. Connect with others and build meaningful relationships outside of social media, and if they can be further expanded through electronic communication, fair enough. But don't expect online communication to operate as the be-all, end-all. It's simply yet another tool in the toolbox, which can be mismanaged to disastrous extents if one isn't cautious. Loneliness is tough to mitigate, but it certainly can be done. People come and go, but the one constant which remains in your life is you. Solitude isn't inherently negative, and being with others doesn't automatically imply that your loneliness will vanish. As the late Robin Williams once remarked, quote, "I used to think that the worst thing in life was to end up alone. It's not. The worst thing in life is to end up with people who make you feel alone." End quote. Find those people who don't make you feel alone, who make you feel that you matter. Who knows, perhaps all you need is yourself, rather than others, to accomplish those objectives.